Welcome to Doing It My Way by Beata Matras, a podcast about project and product management, communication, brand, and IT. All these topics will definitely improve and have a positive impact on your career. So join me today, subscribe, and expect a new episode every week. Thank you. Today I have a remarkable guest, Bevin Mohabeer, and principal product designer, advisor, and mentor. Bev has an extensive background in building best-in-class design practices across the UAE, Europe, and North America. And his career highlights include leading digital and customer experience initiatives at the Experience Abu Dhabi, JP Morgan, Marks and Spencer's, and many more. And in this episode, we'll explore UX and design principles and delve into effective networking strategies. Welcome, Bev. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Beata. I'm really excited to have this conversation finally. I think we talked about it maybe a couple of months ago, and now we're finally here. So I'm really excited for it.
Yeah, thank you for accepting my invite. And yeah, the negotiations with you were pretty difficult, but I'm happy that you agreed to join. And Bev, could you start by giving our listeners a brief overview of your background and your journey in the professional world?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So Bev is short for a much shorter name, which is short for a much longer name. But Bev kind of stuck when I moved here to the UAE. So my career basically started in London. So I've been born and raised in London my entire life. I've been exposed to like lots of different professions and different backgrounds. But I think since I was 16, I probably decided that, you know, when someone says to you, what do you want to do when you grow up? I said, you know, I think I want to tell people that I'm a designer. I think that's pretty cool. And my high school teacher was a product designer himself, like an industrial product designer. And he showed us like how he used to make women's shoes for a living. And I said, well, that's interesting, because I thought anybody who studies design basically becomes a teacher, like you. And he said, no, I'm a teacher by design. And I've basically learned the craft and the industry. And I was blown away, honestly. And I just wanted to kind of work underneath him, learn everything there is to know about the design industry. Kind of went in a bit of a hiatus during university, kind of did something very different. But in the professional world, I entered the design space back in 2016. I did one of those General Assembly boot camps just to kind of see where the design industry was like picking up. I had a very big graphic design background, but now this whole thing about user experience design was kind of picking up and gaining traction at the time. And, you know, I went into that type of course thinking, well, just because you do 10 weeks of design work doesn't necessarily mean that you become a designer overnight. Like, you need to kind of build a bit more of a reputation. You got to build your network, funny enough. And also you need to like actually have skills underneath you. So I spent about 6 months basically trying to find different pieces of work. And then eventually I found a consulting firm that said, you know, we'd be happy for you to join our office in London, but you can also join our office in Dubai. And I spoke with the creative directors over there, and I thought, hey, you know, like let's see how this really goes. In 2017, and since then, I've basically gone from Dubai to India to New York to Toronto, all the way back to Dubai, almost a little bit in Europe. And in that time, it's been focusing on building out experience design into the world, you know, so launching different products, launching different applications. And that's now led to almost about 30 plus products in the world that at least I've been a part of. And now my career is kind of like shifted into a much more strategic place, whereby it's more about putting design in places where you least expect. You know, a lot of the times experience design kind of gets fantasized by the leading products of the world in the tech industry. And my role is like, well, there are other companies who also thrive with very good design practices. And, you know, I want to uncover who they are and actually start from scratch. And that's where I find myself today.
Wow, that's actually an interesting approach, because instead of focusing on the biggest brands, you actually are trying to look like also like good examples, just in a smaller scale. That's unusual, I would say. So yeah, that's very interesting. And you have extensive experience in building and leading design teams. So what core principles of UX and design do you emphasize with your teams?
Good question. So I love this type of question because everybody expects a certain answer. And I would say that my design style, I would say, is more like, there's things that the textbook is supposed to tell you, and there's stuff that actually matters in the real world. And it's funny when you say, UX design principles or some of the things that you follow as a design leader, you're expected to say double diamond. You're expected to say, design thinking from IDEO and D School and all this other stuff. And, these are the principles that enable our design teams to be the best versions of themselves. Sure, in principle, that makes a lot of sense. But I think to kind of understand some of the principles that a design team that I like to bring forward is this whole concept of what I call a modern designer. So ultimately now we fall into this design pattern, or at least from the bootcamp stage, is almost like a textbook approach of how you're supposed to follow things. So they introduce you to the double diamond, and what happens is that you end up becoming like a cookie cutter designer out of every bootcamp ever. And it's great because it's the core foundational principles, but you become like everybody else. So my role in terms of a design leader and setting those principles is, how do you step away from that, or how do you stand above that while utilizing that as a foundation? So um, I think when it comes to these types of principles, of course, these things matter. And of course, these things are important to us as designers and the designers in my team. But I think it's more about your behavior in terms of how you carry yourself as a designer amongst a product team or a development team. So if we use the Scrum definition of a development team, it's inclusive of product managers, Scrum masters, developers, and also designers. And I think some of the principles that kind of get overlooked a lot are the things what I consider to be continuous improvement, which is basically what Scrum is yielded for. It's ultimately yielded for shipping increments over a constrained period of time. And rather than focusing on doing the design process properly, or starting with research and then empathizing with users and then building an ideation workshop, that's a luxury in a lot of the times I've done that. I'll be very honest with you. In probably my first 10 projects or first 20 projects I ever worked on as a designer starting out, I probably did research once. I probably did a workshop like twice. It sounds sad, and I don't really want to burst anyone's bubble here, but that is the truth, and quite frankly, the one principle I would say is consistent across all those projects and every project moving forward is this idea of being continuously improving everything around you. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the product itself, so you are a designer in amongst the ecosystem of the Scrum team. So your role is to bring that continuous improvement, not just to the product, but then also to just how people work, or how does the product manager like to coordinate with requirements? How does the developer work with your design file, and what is the best way to communicate the right feature that's best practice for users without breaking the technology in parallel? So I always encourage other design teams, or at least members of my team, to look at areas of continuous improvement, not necessarily within the domain of which you find yourself. So of course try to improve the product, of course, and try to improve the feature. I think a lot of designers fall disappointed in that a lot because they feel like they have to go blue skies all the time. And actually we get this impression from other people in the development team that are like, well, designers are airy fairy and up in the skies and kind of don't really focus on the bigger picture. But I'd rather focus on I try to encourage others at least to improve on what you did yesterday. Your 20% of value that you think you're bringing is actually probably somebody else's 80%. So it's worth celebrating that. And I just want to touch on the second principle that I want to talk about, because there's only really two that I really focus on, is the continuous improvement, and then also the learn by doing. So I'll tell you a story about one of the companies I used to work for. They one of their things they used to have on their welcome pack, they used to have these stickers that you put on the back of your laptop and everything. And it was a bright yellow sticker, and it had like Times New Roman text, and it was very nicely put. But it's had two words. The two words were "fail fast," right? And I was like, why would you put that on the back of your laptop? That's a bit weird. And what I learned from that, and when I said, what does fail fast mean? Like, I don't understand. Like, why would you want to fail? We go through life not wanting to seek failure. Why are we looking for failure? And the CEO, funny enough, said to me, like, listen, fail fast is a thing we used to say amongst the co-founders. And it's this idea about learning by doing, so constantly learning things, do things that you think make sense. And if it fails, that's okay. Just consider it a failure and move on. And just keep learning and keep doing and doing and doing, compounding your lessons over time to the point where you end up with a solution that is something that adds the maximum amount of value. So how does that correspond into a design team? Well, just try different things all the time. Learn by doing things maybe inside or outside of your domain. Maybe sit in a conversation with the CPO or the chief product officer and say, tell me about the roadmap of how you're going to make money over the next couple of years. Like, a designer is not supposed to ask that question, but I feel like I try to encourage others to do so. And if you ask a stupid question, then that's okay, because you failed fast by asking a stupid question, but that's okay because you've learned something. There's a lesson learned behind it. And the fact that you asked the question in the first place is already a good starting point. So continuous improvement each day, incrementally, and learn by doing and failing fast.
And that's what you mentioned about asking questions, like even that are outside of domain, yeah? But I think very often we're not actually encouraged to do it. I mean, there is like a lot of books that tells us like, yeah, ask questions. That's what I'm doing here. But in a work settings, I think that asking questions, I experienced that asking questions wasn't actually, seen well. I was like, okay, she's asking questions. She's making troubles. Yeah. She's asking questions that are not very comfortable, I would say, or difficult to answer. But how we are going to have like this two-way communication and like even like have this engagement into our work if we don't get a simple answers for the questions that are in everyone's mind very often.
Yeah, and I've found a lot of I've had eyes dart in my direction quite more often than they should, by asking certain questions. But then at the same time, I've also had people say to me, I'm really glad that you asked, or at the end being like, I was thinking the same thing, but I didn't have the courage to say so. Or like, sometimes I've asked certain questions and they've kind of looked at me just like, wait, why are you asking that question? More so because it may have been out of context. It may have just not been part of the topic. Or it could have been that, well, you're the designer with the black t-shirt and the headphones. Like, you're not supposed to ask a question about KPIs. Why do you want to know about our KPIs? And it almost, people can either choose to defend, or acknowledge, right? Or they can either just react straight away and be like, well, like that's got nothing to do with you. Or they could lean in and kind of say, well, let me show you a bit of my world because it sounds like you're keen to learn about it. And yeah, like sometimes it's turned around, whereby people have come to me and said, listen, I never thought about thinking about, the product strategy in that way. Just by you asking that question helped us reframe the entire context of what we're talking about. And that's one of the principles of design that I talk about a lot in terms of the continuous improvement. Like, no one else was thinking like that the entire conversation. Every time you've had this strategy meeting, you've always gone through the slides 1 to 10, but no one's ever stopped at slide number 8 and tried to turn it upside down and look at it from a different perspective. And you did that. The designer did that. That's the value that you bring. And that's the continuous improvement that you ultimately seek. And that's continuous improvement outside of your domain, outside of Figma, outside of wireframes, outside of workshops, etc.
Yeah, that's very interesting approach, and yeah, like even having this courage to ask questions, that's what we very often need. But right now, I would like to move to the topic of balancing user needs with business goals, because it's a constant challenge in business. So, how do you approach finding that balance, especially in high stakes projects?
Interesting. The high stakes projects adds a layer of adds a layer of complexity, or at least unfiltered answer. And I'll probably get into a lot of trouble for saying it. But I would say that if the project is high stakes, in order for you to balance the difference between user needs and business goals, etc., and the project is at high stakes, you have to recognize that design is not front and center of everything and the center of the universe. That's what you need to acknowledge. If the stakes are high and you need to balance the user needs and the business goals, you have to understand that design is not at front and center and the top priority of everything. It may not be. And I think that's where lots of designers fail, or at least designers kind of become unenthusiastic in their work, because it's very easy to fall onto the pillows of, oh, well, no one understands design properly. And it's like, well, what do you mean when you say you want people to understand design? You want people to understand users, but how well have you balanced those users' needs against the business goals, right? So to answer that question in terms of how do you create that balance, you need to ultimately do things that you don't think you should do from a designer's perspective. So you have to understand the weightage between whether the company or the product or the business values their metrics over users' goals, or at least what the weightage should be. So when it comes to business goals, you kind of need to understand, what does success look like for the organization and for the company? Now, unfortunately, that's not a question that a designer wants to hear, because a designer wants to prioritize the user and empathize for the user, and rightfully so. But you need to understand, what is the metric that's going to make or break this entire business model. Okay. And then, and only then, can you correlate whether the customer experience or user experience can be integrated into those goals. It's quite tough. It's not necessarily the answer you're expecting as a designer, because you think everybody should just, hold hands in the boardroom and say, we love our users. That's not the case, So in order to do that balance in between, you've got to do the things that you don't think you should do. You should kind of ask the questions that you wouldn't necessarily expect a designer to ask. Things like, what makes or break this product? How does this product make money? How does this business make money? And at the same time, if you're not confident in if you're not confident in asking those questions, then it's best for you to say nothing and to go home and research everything that was discussed and then come back with more constructive questions. That's ultimately how you can find that balance. Do the inner work, I would say, in your own domain as a designer, because you're there to advocate for the user's needs. So if you can't marry that to the business goals in real time, that's okay. Just say nothing. Take home all of the business goals that you have understood, research the ones you don't, find the overlaps, and then come back the next day and ask the right questions.
I love that approach. That's very simple, yeah, because very often we are working in various industries, actually, as a product people, as a designers, and we're more like industry agnostic, yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's normal that we don't understand, like at first, for example, how the users, for example, operate with a certain product, but it's our responsibility to actually understand that if we are going to be the voice of the users in the team. And speaking of striking the right balance, networking is like another area where actually balancing your speaker or the person you're approaching to needs and strategy is crucial. And I know from experience that you have exceptional networking skills. During the event we attended together, it was Product Tank in Dubai. You made an impact by simply joining a conversation, asking just one question, appreciating the main speaker and other participants before leaving, and just saying like, "Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm going," and that caught the attention of the expert. And me also, because it was unusual. Very often we stick to a person who we want to approach and ask, questions and questions and questions. And you can see that, these experts wants to go away. And usually you're also asking questions not about the speaker itself, but about yourself, how to solve your problem. And that leads me to the next question. So, how do you create such a positive impression in professional interactions? How do you take care of that? Is there any recipe?
Is there a recipe? I wouldn't say there's a recipe per se. I think it takes a lot of practice. I think it's willing to kind of look a little bit silly, in some regards. I have to say, first of all, thank you for saying what you said. I think it's come from just making lots of mistakes over time, and actually just just putting myself out there and not being afraid to kind of look a little bit silly. I think, how do you create a positive impression on professional interactions? I think you kind of answered the question there originally, which is that a lot of the times that, when people come with a question, they want to talk about themselves. And that's the biggest mistake you could probably make when it comes to trying to make a positive impression on somebody. Ultimately, if you're going to approach somebody in a professional setting, if you're going to speak to them, then they have the platform. Okay, they are on stage. Okay, you are their audience, right? So the last thing that you kind of want is that for the audience to start talking about themselves and being disruptive, right? Okay. You know, I think if you want something from someone, I would say that let them speak, give them the autonomy to be able to think and answer the question constructively. And if you do want to have to talk about yourself and actually just say how you're feeling about their scenario, or try to show that you relate to their scenario, then ask for them to set that up, right? And ask to set that up with them to say, listen, I'd love to share my experiences with you. Would you be willing to have an extra conversation? On first glance, what people tend to do is let's say they want to meet someone and have a professional interaction. They try to find some common ground between each other. And in order to sell that common ground, they end up talking about themselves. Bear in mind, this is coming from someone who talks about himself a lot, and has done that a lot in his previous life. And I think I wouldn't say I found a recipe, but I think I've kind of been a bit more aware that it happens. But ultimately, when you approach someone professionally, they are the subject. Okay. And it's actually a lot easier to really get some acceptance when you acknowledge somebody else, as opposed to you trying to offload yourself onto others. I think a lot of the times, anybody who is coming from a place of knowledge or thought leadership, if you were to ask them in a private setting, they would probably say that they feel a little bit like an imposter, or they kind of feel like, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm not supposed to be on stage. I'm not supposed to be mic'd up. However, what's really interesting is that if you validate that fact that they are a thought leader, or that they have a certain degree of excellence, it almost reassures any sort of anxiety that they have within themselves. So before they've stepped up on stage, before they've done anything, they've done any presentation, they're feeling something inside. They feel like they don't belong there. I mean, at least a lot of the people that I've spoken to. And the thing is, if you come up to someone and you want to make a positive impression, just acknowledge their greatness. Just let them, because I think if you say that, that will neutralize every single anxiety and imposter syndrome that they have, because whenever they put themselves out there onto a platform, they get responses and people want to build professional relationships with them, and they feel like they need to keep up this persona. Whereas if you want to know something about someone, just acknowledge the fact that they did something great, and then everything just becomes neutralized, and everything just becomes like a normal conversation, just like how you would meet someone in a coffee shop or even in a public place. I think when it comes to asking your question, always keep your question within the relation to, or keeping the topic about them, or about something that they did or something that they said, so, I think if I go back to the scenario that we had at Product Tank, there was probably 5 or 6 different things that I could have related to when it came to asking him that question, being like, well, that happened to me one time, and you'll never guess what. And then it starts to become about me. Like, he doesn't care about me. Let's be honest. I'm the one who wanted to ask a question. So my priority should be this person. It should be him. And furthermore, I'm doing this in a group. So I have to be mindful of other people, because there's probably other people who want to do the same thing. So quite frankly, the way that I approached it and the way that I would approach other people is to keep the topic and the spotlight on them at all times when you are asking your question. Always relate it back to the things that they did, not necessarily the things that you did. And if you want someone to really care for the things that you have to say, then create that environment to ask the question of, well, I'd love for you to hear my story. Would you be willing to have a conversation, or can I call you, or can we have coffee or something? And if they say yes, then that means they want to know about you also. And that's your platform. And then it goes on from there.
That's very interesting. But the main thing is to be focused on them rather than on yourself. And even empathizing with them. I mean, what you said about the imposter syndrome, and what you said about that they have a lot of anxiety. I mean, I was also speaking at the conferences, and of course, I was on the stage, I was thinking what am I doing here? Yeah. Me, what can I, tell other people, that would be beneficial for them, but somehow I found myself there. I applied, for example, for a space and I got it. So, so that's it. But very often, I think the questions from the audience are also about, how to solve a certain problem, but in a kind of harsh way, I would say. I mean, very often, the audience is trying to ask the questions to challenge whether you're an expert. That happens very often too. And what about this kind of behavior?
Well, that's interesting, because that happens a lot more frequently than you think, right? Because it can come from a place of insecurity or jealousy in some ways, because you almost some people ask questions to try and trip up the person who's on the platform. And it's coming from a place of well, what makes you think that you can be up there and I have to sit down here, kind of thing. I know that sounds very cynical, but if we looked really deeper into why people ask certain questions, that's usually where they're coming from. They're sitting there and well, you seem like an expert, but you're talking about everything that I already know. So why aren't I standing on that stage? Why don't I have the microphone in my hands? So then they throw this energy over to you in a professional way. It's not cynical in any way, but it's still professional. But it almost feels like, you have to defend yourself when you're on the platform, and you're kind of just well, why are you asking me that question, kind of thing? You know what I mean? And you're already anxious as it is, because you just stepped up there. You've already built up all of the courage, and it's so graceful that you are able to stand up there so modestly and say your piece and speak openly and clearly. You deserve to be celebrated for that. And I don't understand when people ask those types of questions where they say things like, well, what do you think about this? Because you didn't mention anything about this, and I think about this more than you do. Just think about what I just said there, right? you've just turned that whole question about yourself. It's got nothing to do with you, right? Yeah. You're almost trying to validate to that other person as an opposition that you deserve to be recognized for your talent. And that happens especially often in group settings, because there's an establishment trying to understand like who's the more senior person within the group, and how can I leverage more connections if I show my authority elsewhere. It's funny how people call that networking, you know, which is like how many networks can I connect with over a space of time. I think we talked about this as well. Is like, you know, people show up to the event and they say, "Hey, how are you? So what do you do? Oh, do you have LinkedIn? Do you have a business card?" And then you give it
Yeah.
over, and it is like, "Okay,
We
thanks,
never
bye."
speak again. Yeah,
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 exactly.
yeah.
And I'm like, that's not
Yeah.
networking. Okay, like when I think about networking and I think about, you know, the relationships that I've kept with like other professionals and kind of the relationships that I've formed from the connections that I've built. I mean, you know, we talk about networking as, and LinkedIn is like the biggest social networking platform. Yeah. And it's all about building connections. So let's break down those words for a minute. If I think about the most meaningful connections that have ever occurred in my life, it's when people have made me feel like I am the center of attention. You know, um, it's not been by me screaming as loud as I can into this microphone. You know, I mean, social media has become a little bit like that to this day. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. I think it has to shift in some ways, but I think the most authentic relationships and connections you can build professionally is when you allow people or you recognize others for their greatness, and they will always pay it back forward. Because if somebody says to you, you know, I'm so amazed by how you do things or how you speak or your opinion on things, you know, first of all, it validates your effort and all of your hard work and all of your, you know, your own awareness. But then it also gives you the impression to reciprocate that back to me, you know, and it's not in a narcissistic way. It's more of just like, well, hang on, how come a person like this is telling me that I'm so great? Look at how great this person is. And isn't that much more of an authentic networking connection, as opposed to, oh, we just happen to be at the same event and we have the same color business cards. Thank you very much. And I think I know more than you do, but it'll be good to keep in touch. Like, that's not networking.
Yeah, that's not networking. It's more about, like, I remember like how we've met actually, because my next question is going to be about that building relationships can often lead to exciting projects or collaborations, which we're doing right now, for example. And I remember during, you know, the event that we were together, we also like, you know, met another professional that also led to recording a podcast. And we spent like a significant amount of time together. It wasn't just, you know, like most people were like, you know, running from one person to like another and just, yeah, hi, how are you? Yeah, I'm good. You know, I'm looking for a job. Okay. Do you have LinkedIn? Can I connect with you on LinkedIn? Oh, okay. Thank you. And then gone. And I'm it's like I was like sitting for a while, like with the recruiters, and I was like, does it really work? I mean, I asked this recruiter, like, how do you feel, like, you know, with that kind of approach? Like, how do you feel like it's more like a speed dating or something? Because it feels like that a little bit. Instead of questions like, what are your interests? It's like, do you have LinkedIn? So, um, yeah. But from your experience, how has networking directly led to interesting opportunities, different than this podcast recording?
Well, that's what I was about to say. Like, I think, you know, networking has led to this very interesting opportunity, and I think that's amazing. So if anybody thinks networking doesn't work, I guarantee you I'm on a pretty amazing podcast right now. So it certainly gives you an interesting opportunity. Okay. So don't knock it till you try it. How has it directly led to interesting opportunities? Ultimately, um I don't want to be really cliche and people say like, oh, your network is your net worth. You know what I mean? Like, because what does that really mean? Let's just use simple English here for a minute. Ultimately, networking has given me the opportunity to meet lots of different people. Of course, it's led to different job offers. It's led to different opportunities. It's allowed different follow-ups. It's given me enough coffees to make my heart race within one day. Yeah, networking is led to lots of different opportunities, but I think the biggest opportunity that networking has given me is to act as a canvas to practice and communicate my story, my message, and how I want to be presented to the world. Every time I speak to people is an opportunity to validate whether what I'm saying is actually true, or whether people actually understand where I'm coming from. I think at this very start of my UX career, they're like, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And I said, "Well, I'm a UX designer." And they're like, "What's UX design?" And then that became a meme on the internet where people were like, "How do you describe UX design to your grandmother?" And things like that. And I was like, well, I do more than just user experience design. It's almost too technical. So I just started labeling myself as a designer. And then people started asking, well, what kind of design? Are you in fashion? Are you in brand? And I'm just like, okay, actually, my design probably isn't as cool as people think it is. But what are all of these things? They're all repetitions. They're all opportunities for me to just really communicate well in terms of how do I present myself to others? How do I communicate the values that I have in life, or my experiences and so on? It's led to lots of different things, but ultimately these people say, "Oh, I found my job at a networking event," or "I, met an amazing startup founder and now I'm an investor." Like, yes, maybe those are the opportunities where networking can directly relate to. But what I think is the biggest opportunity of all is for you to really assess how you present yourself to the world, and actually how do you articulate your narrative and your story to others. And every time you network with someone, every time you meet somebody, is an opportunity for you to practice that. And you can choose to practice that just by speaking to people. You can put yourselves in different environments. I'll tell you this very interesting story where there was a networking event where we basically said, you can have a 30-second pitch if you want to pitch your business idea as if, so people lined up in a queue and everything else like that. And they'd give you this microphone and you had to stand on stage and you basically had to pitch your business. And if you went over 30 seconds, you get water shot at you through a water gun, which was quite funny. But I used that as an opportunity to basically say, look, I'm going to stand here and practice my 30-second pitch on who I am, what I do, and where I would, and what am I doing at this event. And I got better and better at it over time. But I remember doing it the first time, and a startup founder came to me and said, I have never met anybody whose pitches their design services before, but I could really use your help. That is pure luck, by the way, just so you know. Yeah, I didn't orchestrate that. I didn't manifest that. That's not a story for the podcast. That is pure luck. Yeah. But the second time that event came around, I did exactly the same thing and I said the same words and I got nothing. Okay. So these are two opportunities to network, and try and get interesting opportunities. And one yielded a different response to another. And the whole value, I would say, is that, this practice and this getting in front of people and actually asking interesting questions helps you articulate the right way on how to enter conversations, how to maintain conversations, and how to leave conversations. And that's arguably the biggest opportunity you can learn from networking, is just how to present yourself and arguably how to be a human being.
Yeah, and how to present yourself, because I think presenting yourself right now is very important, because we leave people with a certain impression. Yeah, we leave people with certain emotions after we leave. So we also need to consider what kind of emotional state and what kind of impression we want to leave on that people. And very often I think we don't care about that. I mean, in the past I didn't care about it, but right now I'm more self-aware, or maybe just aware of how certain people made me feel, and that I don't want to like pass it, for example, to others. Yeah. I prefer to like, regulate it by myself, like, forget about it, whatever. But you never know who is this person. And even if, if it's not like a startup owner, but it's just this is just a human being like you. Yeah. You don't have to go around and spread your unhappiness around. You can be just, more mindful about others too.
Absolutely. And I think, it doesn't always have to be, people say networking is professional and, I'm here to build my professional network. Like, networking or putting yourselves in these types of opportunities just ultimately lets people know who you are and how you carry yourself. At this same event, somebody came up to me and said to me, I just really like your energy. There's something about just how you speak, or just how you can get really excited about the smallest things. Like, I heard you speaking to a health tech startup founder who's seeking investment, and you got really excited for some reason, but like, you've barely been in the tech industry for more than 5 minutes. So how can you be so excited so quickly? But that's what they recognize just from my presentation of myself. And that's ultimately what the networking and getting opportunities are. It's just to identify if your personal brand really does connect with people, and yields the outcome that you're looking for. Personal branding is huge nowadays. Everybody wants one, right? Um, and it's great because you can go and get one and you can do all the strategy work to kind of make it happen. But how hard does it hit? Do people actually understand you? And I think that's where your personal brand really has the most value in a networking context, is how many people actually see you and not the brand, or how do they feel when you are presented after in front of them, and beyond what you say. It's not necessarily about what you say all the time. It's more about the way you carry yourself, the way you dress, the way you look, the way you have presented yourself, the energy that you carry, the words that you say is one of many, many things. So yeah, I completely agree with that aspect of, like, networking is just about presenting your authentic self, and seeing how many people connect with it. And sometimes, if people in this room don't connect with it, then find a new room. There's many more down the hall.
Yeah, that's true. And many people also like feel anxious about starting, or starting the conversation or asking questions. From your perspective, what strategies can help professionals to overcome this hesitation?
Well, we live in a digital age, so I think hiding behind your keyboard is probably a nice way of starting, because you don't necessarily have to always go in front of people and speak clearly and like have your elevator pitch memorized. So we do have a digital age whereby you can always reach out to people in silence, on your own terms, which is a very beautiful fact. But I think when it comes to starting any conversation or asking any question, and the strategy you can have to, whenever you feel slightly hesitant, is to understand what you want to ask before you ask it. And I use the example of, when we were at Product Tank in Dubai. I didn't really know what question to really ask him. I was kind of just like, well, I actually want to talk to you about something else, but like, I don't really know what to really ask you. And for some reason, I was waiting. I thought, you know what? Let me just be silent and let me just acknowledge everything that he's saying. And if there's something that connects or resonates, just try to jump in with a question, but in a polite way. Don't try and derail the conversation, but just try and pitch in your thought, or just ask him a follow-up question or something like that. But a lot of the groundwork was trying to understand what I wanted to ask before I asked it, right? And I don't even remember what I asked him, but I think I just said, like, going back to what you said earlier about this, I mean, that already creates the impression that you were listening. Yeah. And that already builds trust. And then from there, then you can obviously ask the question you want to ask. So giving your time to really acknowledge what you want to ask prior to asking it is really important. I think some people do it better than others. Some people can do it in real time. Some people take a bit of time and wait for a perfect opportunity when they're just, no one's around them, and they kind of just go in and ask the question. And that actually ultimately leads me on to another point, is that it's okay to not ask a question in public, especially in a networking setting. So just because you go to an event and you really want to ask someone something, you don't have to necessarily feel like ask them in public. You can reach out to them in a more professional way. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, recognize their talent, recognize that they do something amazing, and then ask your question. But you can do that in a LinkedIn message, and that's okay. And that actually may come across as more professional. And like I said, you are hiding behind a keyboard and a screen. So all the hesitation that's in your head kind of goes away because you're just sending a message over on LinkedIn. And that's a really nice way of kind of doing it, at least trying to get into the comfort of actually asking questions or reaching out to people that you don't know, because that's ultimately what it's really all about as well. So another strategy is to always try to give contextual compliments to people before you ask the question. It sets the expectation. And I don't mean like things like, well, oh, you're such an inspiration and I love how you speak. And like, you're a pioneer in the product space. It's like, okay, relax, like calm down. Actually give them a compliment of what you actually observed about them, Like I'll give you a very simple example. Like there's one thing that I really like in public speakers is when they navigate the stage, when they walk back and forth. And what I do is if I get a chance to speak to somebody who's on stage and I say, listen, I really like the way that you pitch or the way that you communicate, especially the pacing up and down, because it kind of it makes sure that the focus is always on you. And I really like that. They might have done that on purpose, or they might have done that by accident. But the fact that you've recognized that that is a tactic that kept you engaged validates their value of public speaking. And like I said before, it neutralizes the scenario without it being like, well, I need something from you or you need something from me. It's kind of like, listen, I value you as an individual and I wanted to say something. So compliment on something that you've ultimately observed that's in relation to your question. Sometimes it can be like, I really like the way you articulated this topic. And then you asked a question about said topic. And one final thing I will say, one final strategy is that normally one question is enough.
Yeah, that's very important, because sometimes we feel like the more questions we ask, the more, I don't know, the smarter we will look like. But let's give a space to others to also ask their questions. It's not about us, it's about them. Yeah, so that's very important, and we need to keep it in mind. A lot of people is speaking that networking is like very transactional. So how do you stay true to yourself while also like building your professional network? How to balance that?
That's a very good question. That's very interesting because a lot of people, they do feel like it is a transactional piece. My answer to that is deliver value and expect nothing. And that's the only way that networking can go well in your favor, because ultimately you are bringing forth something that is of valuable to others and you expect nothing in return. Okay. But normally by doing that, you end up receiving things beyond what you could ever imagine, So, even I think when we met and we were obviously quote unquote networking and then became, started talking about life and other things. The whole purpose of getting into that conversation was just to bring value in terms of like having a meaningful conversation with somebody from Dubai or someone who had been here for a long time. And I had no expectations after that, right? It was just like, listen, you know what? Like you've been here. I've been here for 8 years. You've been here for 8 hours. let's just have a conversation, you know, very simple. And all I ever wanted to do in that conversation is just to bring value, and I expected nothing else from it other than, you know, a thank you. That's it. But to stay true to yourself when it comes to that, and like that's obviously one principle you can follow. I think the overarching answer is that you should have a set of principles behind your vision and mission as a professional before you start talking to people, you know. And I think that, you know, being true to yourself and being honest is all centered around your values and your principles. Okay. And I don't think enough people in the professional world have done the inner work to really understand what their vision and mission and purpose is within their professional world. I'm not saying that they have to, you know, become the next Elon Musk, or basically just, you know, do something so extravagant that like no one has ever seen before. I'm not saying that, but your mission and values can be so rooted into who you are. I think if you have that set within your vision before you start talking to people, that's how you can stay ultimately true to yourself, or at least authentic in that regard. Like very simply, one of my principles is to cut the nonsense within the design community. Like a lot of people tend to be talking about the same things in the design community. Like I think the topic of atomic research has been talked about for the past 7 years since I heard about it. And I'm like, well, can we talk about something else? And, you know, one of my principles as a design leader, or how I present myself, is that, look, you know, obviously I know everything that designers are supposed to know, which is about here, but then I also know how the real world actually operates. And my conversation, whenever I speak to new people, is to understand where they sit within the gap of that spectrum. And that's one of my principles. And that's one of the things that I try to bring forward when I have meaningful conversations. If I find myself just repeating and regurgitating the same information over time, then I'm not cultivating a very valuable professional network. And ultimately, I'm not a design puppet. At least I don't think I am. So, you know, that's also being true to myself. I'm not just another designer off the boot camp factory line. You know, I feel like I have more of an identity around that. So, you know, every conversation, of course, that I had or that I have with people when I'm networking is ultimately a validating factor towards that vision and mission that I have, and is in alignment to the things that I believe in the design community. And the thing is that those are my principles. That's how I behave. That's how I carry myself. That's how I mentor people. That's how I lead teams. It's how I educate organizations. It's with these undeniable set of principles and proof that I am who I say I am. And I understand what those are before I have a conversation with anybody. And that has come as a result of doing the inner work of understanding my vision, mission, and values behind my professional domain.
Yeah, so it all, you know, comes down to more like self-awareness and inner work than specific behaviors, or like like, you know, mimic some techniques or something like that. And for those looking to build or expand their networks, what practical tips would you offer? Although we like covered a lot, but if we could like, you know, mention the most important ones, that would be useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it goes back to almost the first question when it comes to the design principles you bring to teams, and also like the idea of like learning by doing and actually failing fast, that whole thing. I think anybody who wants to expand their network just needs to actually, the way you get better at networking is doing more networking. Okay. Now it's the same. It's one of those things that I used to hate as a child, when my dad used to say to me, like, well, the only way you're going to get good at maths is if you do more maths. And I'm like, that's not really how life works, is it? But apparently it is, because all the most famous athletes and the most amazing people in the world are who they are through practice. So if you want to become the best networker in the world, or you want to build the most high value set of connections, it comes from just being able to reach out to lots of different people, try different methods, also try to get how to communicate yourself towards others, and actually improving it over time and saying, well, that didn't really work. Somebody doesn't actually understand what UX is, so let me stick to product design. Let me try service design, see if people understand that. Again, only if it sits within your core principles that you've defined within yourself. So for anyone who's looking to expand, obviously just do more, like you can just practice more, go and speak to people at events, of course, but then also just say, you know what, I'm going to try my elevator pitch on 5 people just organically and just see how it goes. If you do it organically, you'll realize that that is the true self. That's the true core of how you present yourself. And that's a really good lesson to learn. I think another tip I would say is maybe an exercise you can carry forward is, see if you can get comfortable with rejection. And I know that sounds probably going to scare a lot of the audience because they're a bit like, well, I don't want to be rejected. I want to be accepted and I want people to like me. Like, of course, I want people to like me too. But the way that networking sometimes goes is that you can't fight the fact that sometimes networking just feels like, that transactional approach, like, oh, I've given you acknowledgement, so you have to give me something. And often people feel derailed by networking because they don't get something in return. But that's where you need to get comfortable with rejection. And like I said, deliver value and expect nothing. And how can you get comfortable with rejection? Well, you can do it in every single day life. So there's a very interesting concept about, asking for things for free, and actually just trying to see if you can go maybe a week or even 100 days of asking a question and seeing if you can get a response. So for example, let's say you go to your favorite coffee shop every day, and you say, just ask them, can I have this coffee for free? I come in like and then they'll be like, wait, what? Like, what do you mean for free? And it's like, well, I come in here every day. You see me here at 8 a.m. every day. Like, can I just have this one for free just because I'm here all the time? And just see what they say. 90% of the time, they're going to say no. Okay. But even if they say no, you'd be like, okay, thank you very much. At least you tried. Okay. Like you tried something, it didn't work. That's okay. You failed fast, right? So learn by doing more of those things. Get your reps in when it comes to actually just speaking to people and asking for things that you probably don't deserve. Like you don't deserve a free coffee, let's be honest. Just because you go into the same place every day. Maybe you do if they have loyalty programs, but normally you don't deserve a free coffee from an institution. But what happens if you ask? Maybe they'll give it to you. 90% of the time they won't. So get comfortable with that 90%. Because when you go into a networking environment or you try to build a relationship with someone or a professional connection with someone, they may not provide an outcome that you're expecting, and you need to be ready for that.
That's interesting approach. That's very interesting approach. I never thought about it in that way. I mean, even the exercise is like very exciting. Maybe I'm going to try today.
That's why I've paid like 1.5 times more for coffees than I normally should have, because they increase the price every time I ask for it to be free, rather than selling it for the actual price. So it's my own fault. But hey, you learn.
Yeah, you learn.
I learned that it doesn't work.
Yeah. So you actually shared some excellent advice on networking, not mentioning the kind of question about the coffee. But as we wrap up, let's shift to broader reflections and what's ahead for you. So, given all that we've covered today about design principles, about networking, about self-awareness also, what's the one key piece of advice you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I would say anybody who's listened to this podcast today, whether you're a designer, a product manager, a developer, a management consultant, whatever it may be, and you're curious about building your network, or you want to understand how to become a better professional altogether, my one piece of advice would be to do the inner work. Okay. I would say that the most awareness I've ever found from networking is by being alone. And a lot of people would say, well, what does that mean? How can you build a network if you're by yourself? Well, I've sat on my own in comfortable spaces, done a lot of reading, some parts meditation, some parts workshopping and brainstorming to really understand who I am and where am I going, and understanding what my vision, mission, and values are, and the set of principles based on the evidence that I have to say that I am who I say I am. And for me to be able to construct that narrative on my own has allowed me to put myself on the hook towards others to then see who resonates with my message, who resonates with what I'm saying. Is what I'm saying actually meaningful, or is it adding value? Which rooms are listening to me? And those are the rooms where I've built my network for moving forward. And I think anybody who's willing to just take the time, even if it's just sitting in a coffee shop on your own, or even if it's just, walking through the park, and completing your exercise ring, just really think critically and about the inner work that you need to do in order to present yourself as the professional that you want to become. Then and only then, all of the strategies, all of the principles that we've discussed today will yield results based on a proper, well-established foundations that only you can do. Nobody can do that for you. So I would advise anybody who wants to become a better professional to do that inner work, understand who they are, where they're going, identify the principles of what your voice should stand for, or how you want to be received, and then go out there and practice.
Yeah. that's very deep advice. So basically, get more self-awareness of who you are, and then show up to the world and see what happens. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what about upcoming projects or personal adventures? What are you most excited about?
So for me, I think I'm moving into a new role, at least within my career, which is quite exciting. I think over the first 5 years of my career has been very much about like, let's just throw everything at this design thing and see how far you get. And after 5 years, it went from being a junior associate towards heading up a fully fledged 20-person design team. And now the next upcoming projects has been all about taking on conversations that you don't expect designers to be having. So I think, what are we now? I think we're like 3 years into the 5-year plan. And in that time, it's been talking with management consultants, government entities, business operations individuals, and just being a designer in the room, even though they don't expect you to be in that room. And now the next opportunity, of course, is for working in a very well-established but niche market within a startup, which is quite exciting. In terms of personal adventures, I would say that the inner work doesn't stop; it's always continuous. I think there's lots of lessons we learn from our professional work that we do every day, but then also the people that we meet. I'm trying to get a lot better of actually getting in front of people and actually communicating better. A lot of the time I tend to sit back and kind of like live within my own inner work and be like, well, everything's great because it's all on my nice Miro board that's all vertically and horizontally aligned. But I think one thing that I'm trying to get better at is obviously getting in front of people and actually doing more practice and building more of that network, because the next round of 5 years moving forward after the design where you least expect phase, would be, can I stand alone and be able to articulate my value in the right way? And that starts from getting in front of people. So that's what I'm excited for.
Yeah, that's one of the chances to be, more in front of people. So I think it's starting to it's starting to go on. It started actually. And for our listeners who want to connect with you or learn more about your work, where they can find you online.
So the best place is LinkedIn. My LinkedIn is probably the most active social media platform that I have. So if you search for Bev Mohabeer in LinkedIn, it'll probably be the first one you come up. I'll actually add the link as well for my design portfolio. So it's really easy to remember. It's bevmox.com. So BEVMOX.com. And it's a recently launched website and portfolio. But, over there, it just showcases some of the most recent work that I've done recently. But if you have any questions about anything we discussed today, obviously LinkedIn is the best place to get in touch.
Okay. I'll link the website and your LinkedIn to the podcast description. And I wanted to really thank you, Bev. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for useful tips for networking, for design principles, and everything in between. It was a very good conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I had a really, really good time. I think obviously been following the podcast since we've met and seeing the different repertoire of guests that you've had. It's nice to be acknowledged by you and obviously by your audience to be within this elite group of individuals. So I am so grateful for that, and massive respect for the amount of work that you've done on this podcast and the audience that you reach. And it's genuinely amazing to be a part of it all. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Doing It My Way by Beata Matras. If you enjoyed this episode, please do not forget to subscribe. Remember, this podcast is a dynamic journey and your feedback is very welcomed. Connect with me on social media. I would like to hear your thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions. And stay tuned for upcoming episodes. And until next time, keep doing it your way.